permaculturist and author. Lucy has worked around the world and has a lot to say right now about worm farms. So I'll leave you with Lucy. Thank you.
Thank you. So as Stephanie said, my name is Lucy. I've worked several years in Brazil, 20 years in Brazil, working on an ecological farm or ecological center, using permaculture strategies and other strategies as well. And from that, I was lucky enough to become an author of a book that's called Planet Schooling, because I started working with adults and then decided children were way easier. Adults have way too much baggage, whereas kids were open. So I started focusing a lot of my work with children. But today I'm going to be talking about worm farming because it's one of my passions. Sorry if I'm walking around too much. I was saying I've got Italian heritage, so I can't stand behind this. I have to throw my arms around. I started working with worms in Brazil, because the center that we created had no trees. Absolutely, it was cow-trodden, it was destroyed. The farmer that we purchased the land from was quite proud because he said, "I've cleaned the land for you," which is, he was quite horrified when we purchased the land and started creating a forest, a food forest, and also organic gardens. Quite similar to the chap that just spoke, about working with the soil. I had a book on worms, so I was like, my daughter and she was 6 when we went to Lila, who spoke in the first talk. She was 6 when we went to Brazil, and we wanted to create a worm farm. So we found a friend of ours, nobody was selling worms. A friend of ours had a packet of compost, and I started collecting all the eggs. Okay, and eggs, I bought little show and tell. Of course, this is giant. Composting worm eggs look similar to this. Okay, they're little tiny little amazing spheres that are tiny in your palm, so you can go through worm compost and start collecting your little eggs. So that was one of her first homeschooling projects. Let's create a worm farm. Now, the books I had about worm farms or about worms, nothing worked. What I realized, most of the books created about permaculture and worm farms and other organic gardening is all temperate. Now, Brazil has a number of ants that pick things up and walk away with it. So you can have a worm farm during the day, and at night time, the ants are there walking away with free food. Oh, look at these chunky worms, and just would take all your worms away. And then you had giant cane toads coming in. Same thing, at night time, coming in for us, they have a little bit of a dig. The lizards come, dig for them, and then they burrow in. So I was like, oh, nothing works here. So I started my own personal homeschooling project. How do we create worm farms in the tropics? Because ants are way more important than worms in the tropics. But I wanted the comfort of worms, not ants. So then I started the project. Now, today I brought a little show and tell. This is my granddaughter's, she's 2.5, this is her worm farm. So there's a few curiosities about worms that we have to talk about. This worm farm's probably, this is a mini worm farm, but I work with big worm farms too. This is just for you to have a little squizzy, have a look. So worm farms need to be at least 30 centimeters in height. Why is that? Worms love to burrow and go down, to burrow and go down. Okay, so if you're going to make a worm farm, because we've got the worm farms that we can make with, the little apartment models, which is like the first world worm farm. So then you've got the worm farms that you'll make in a cardboard box, in a fruit cart, in a fruit crate, or things like that. So if you're doing something on the cheap, you want something that's at least 30 centimeters in height, okay? Because you want your worms to burrow and go down. And you're not going to put earthworms in this box, because earthworms will be like, whatever, I need space. They need a lot of space. You're going to find your red composting worms. In Australia, we use Californian red. They're lazy worms. They don't want to go too deep. So if I take the lid off later, you'll see a whole bunch of worms around the food. They don't want to burrow too deep. They just want to like sit in the sun, not really because I hate sun, but sit in the lower layer, the upper layers of the soil and eat and eat and eat. We also use African tiger worms, but they're harder to find. You can find them more so in other countries. But the favorite in Australia is your red worm, which is the Californian worm. Californian red. So you don't want to try, because some people say, I collect all these earthworms from the soil and I put them in a farm and all they do is escape. Yeah, because they want the earth. Okay, they're not composting. These are the worms you'll find in a forest naturally. If you just pull the leaf litter away, you'll find worms. These are the worms you want to get. So that's really important for a successful worm farm. Now, we are going to talk about food. What food, or how do you make the bedding? Now, if you've got questions, I'm okay if you just throw your arm up during and we'll make Stephanie run. You can interrupt me. Like I said, that culturally, I'm fine with that. So, with worms, you have to make the bed first. Now, I'm joking about the first world and third world, or south and north, because we know that, like in Brazil, you can't find coconut. You can't go to a Bunnings and buy a little block of coconut core that's ready to just throw in water and puff up. Okay? They don't have that thing. In a lot of countries, they don't have it. We're actually really lucky because everything's easy for us. We can go to the council tip shop and buy a worm farm. We can go to Bunnings and buy whatever. So in Bunnings, what you'd do, you'd go get your coconut core and you'd put it in water and it will go poof. It will puff up and you throw it in your compost and there's your bedding. But even if you're in other countries, you'll use probably half of cardboard without colour. Okay, you don't want to put colour into your soil. So you find a natural, a plain cardboard box, soak it or rip it up and soak it. And horse poo. Horse poo is like an aphrodisiac for worms. They love it. Okay, so you go around and you'll collect I noticed that horse poo around here is only $2 a bag. Where I come from, it's $5 a bag. So I'm like thinking, will hubby mind if I fill the car up with horse poo? I think he will. So you grab your horse manure, or you can use cow manure, semi-dry. You don't want the fresh stuff because that will burn the worms. Because worms are 95% water. So if they hit the sun or if they hit a hot compost pile, what will happen? They'll shrivel up and you'll see a crunchy worm. And, they say crunchy worms are only good for burgers. So, because McDonald's is actually trying to make, I shouldn't say McDonald's, cut that. Anyway, going back to worms. So you'll have your half of your horse manure or your cow manure and half wet cardboard, and you just mix it together, and you pop it in your worm farm. You've saved $20. Okay, I use that way. I don't go and buy, the block, because I'm like, wow, all you're doing is buying coconut husks. You can do that. You can actually strip a tree, not kill it, but just when the coconut trees have that, palms have that husky bit, you can actually strip that off and cut it and shred it. So this is we're talking low cost. So then you put your worms in, and usually I just pop the worms in a corner, okay? And I leave them there, I cover it. Some people buy this really chic little tumbleweed mat. I use hessian or cardboard. You can pop that on and then pop your lid on. Now, you need to have a lid because the worms will naturally try to escape. They'll want to go find greener pastures. Maybe the neighbour's got a nicer forest, and they'll be like, yeah, I want to get over there. So we usually leave a lid on it, but the lid has to have air holes, okay? They have to be breathing. Now, it's really important that the bedding isn't too mushy and isn't too dry. They're a princess, okay? They don't want it too mushy and they don't want it too dry. They just want it just right. How can you tell a worm farm is just right? You pick up some of your I'm going to talk about the cow poo cardboard mix. You'll pick it up and you'll squash it like a sponge. And if a few drops come out, that's perfect. If you pick it up and squash it and you've got coming out, the worms may not like it. Okay, so you want something that's not too runny and not too dry. And that's just like picking it up and squashing it. And cow poo is fine. I actually think cow poo is quite amazing. And Rudolf Steiner did a big study on the magic of cow poo, about going through the bellies of the cow, different bellies, and talking about microbes, collecting microbes along the way. And when they poo, it's like, whoa, this is magic, okay, especially for our gardens. So then feeding. What do worms love to eat? Worms will eat anything, okay? The books say, don't feed this, don't feed that. They actually eat anything. I went to the Amazon, and I was like, with my Anglo cockiness, went to the Amazon to see a worm farm. He opens it up, and he's got barrels and barrels and barrels. Every barrel was filled with citrus. And I said to him, haven't you read the books where you're not supposed to feed citrus? And he's like, he picks it up, and like worms are hanging from the citrus. Worms don't like citrus peel, but they love citrus. Why don't they like onion peels? Because in all the books it said, don't feel onion peels and garlic. It's because it takes too long to feed. They don't have teeth. So what they do, they actually suck in the food. Okay, they suck in. Worms don't have eyes. They don't have teeth. How many hearts does a worm have? Does anyone know? Does anyone want to guess? They're full of love. So if you were full of love, how many hearts would you have? 10, nearly? Cut it in half, 5. They have 5 hearts. 5, we call them, the scientists call it chambers, but we know that they're hearts, okay? They're pumping 5 from 5 hearts, which is incredible. So you've got this thing that's blind, that has no teeth, 5 hearts, but creates magic, okay? Creates those little piles of poo that are roughly pH 7. So as you were saying that, sometimes we're fighting to get the right pH for our garden, make worm compost. Worm compost is pH 7. The interesting thing about worm compost, especially sometimes I throw a few worms into, because I use a lot of mulch in my garden. If I've got too many worms, because every 2 months, if the worms are happy, you'll have double amount. Every 4 months, 2 months, I can't remember, but you'll have double the amount. Okay, so after a while, you've got too many worms. You either start giving them away, you can sell them. I give them to schools usually, or sometimes I put them in my garden. Now, they say that the worm, as it's burrowing, and this is like Charles Darwin, because he studied worms for 40 years in a temperate climate, but it's still fascinating. As a worm pushes through the soil, it releases microbes, because it's like consuming nutrients like leaves and dead animals and things like that. So it consumes it and it releases microbes into the soil. And those tunnels that you see, the perfectly burrowed tunnels, have you seen them? Yeah, they're just like beautifully tunneled, and they're smooth. They've got a hole. They're actually throwing microbes into the soil. And then what happens is that attracts other microbes. So Charles Darwin saw in places, like you were saying, that there were no worms, you fix the soil up and worms come. That's because this little egg, I've got one here, I love these little toys. This little egg can wait in the soil, and earthworm eggs are whiter, okay, and they're rounder. They can wait in the soil for 10 years for the right moment. Okay, so they're just sitting there, they're just laying there, and they're just sort of like hibernating. As soon as you get the right environment, these will burst open and throw forth little worms. Now, Charles Darwin, and until today, this is still a mystery to science, there's no uniform. They can't say, well, the red worm, lays 2 worms in each eggs. No, because some eggs have 5 worms will come out. Sometimes 1 worm, sometimes 10 baby worms. They can't work out why. Why is each egg different? Why are they coming forth like worms? So you know that as soon as you fix up your pH, and then if you're lucky enough to have some worm eggs just waiting, they will come forth. And I know that it's interesting because I grew up in Adelaide, and I know in South Australia we suffer lots of drought. And, you know, I know in the rain, when it starts raining, like you've got rock hard soil, you know, you cannot move it with your toe. You know, you need a shovel to play. You're not playing in the garden, you need a shovel to play in the garden as a kid. And when the soil starts becoming humid and, you know, and like in spring, all of a sudden you've got worms. You're like, where did these come from? It's really fascinating. Now, urban people, I've got 5, I'm a bit obsessive though. I've got 5 different types of worm farms in my home. If you'd like to know, we have a trash bin. In one of the floods, we got an extra trash bin into our garden, and nobody claimed it, so we were like, ooh, make a worm farm. So you can go on, if you Google it, how to make a worm farm from a trash bin. Lila teaches you how to make it. So you can actually make a really big one. We've got worm farms that only create the leachate, the worm juice, how I like it, or the black gold. There's a whole lot of popular names. We've got worm farms that just create lots of liquid. So we can just pick up the liquid and throw it. Most of us lead really busy lives, so I try to narrow it down. I have basically once a week, I'll just open all my buckets, let it drip, and then come back the next day and all my buckets are filled. Now, you can aerate it. You can actually turn that into compost tea, or you can be lazy like me and just mix it with water and throw it on your trees, or you can throw it on your leaves. If you're going to put it on the soil, it's usually 10-1. So 1 part worm juice, 10 parts of water. And we try to use dechlorinated water. Now, you're not going to buy that. What you do is just leave your water overnight. So you get a barrel, fill it up with water, and chlorine evaporates. That's why in pools they have to keep adding chlorine, because chlorine actually evaporates. So you can fill up a barrel, or if you've got rainwater, you're blessed. If you don't, you fill up a barrel and you let the chlorine evaporate, and then you can use that. You can mix your water with your worm juice. Now, if you really like sort of doing the witchy stuff and you want to make compost tea, you can either buy a bubbler, which I bought one from the States, very expensive, doesn't really work. But anyway, I went back to the old arm. You want to get some some arm exercise? You can actually just stir your compost and add air. And as you add air into your worm juice with water, the microbes will increase because they need oxygen. Okay, but you can also put a touch of molasses in it. And molasses is, it's a yummy sugar, and you're feeding them. So you've got sugar with a bit of water and a good old swirl, and you'll have more microbes, beneficial microbes for your garden. Okay, so basically, you're letting nature do most of your work, and you just get a bit of exercise doing it. And like I said, I had this fancy aerator that, you can bubble up for 24 hours and all this magic happens, and I really couldn't be bothered. I'd prefer just, sitting there, listen to music, put it on, do your wiggle, and then you go and use it. So you exercise while you're gardening. Has anyone got any questions so far? Well, we've got a few, yep. Sorry, Steph, we're going to make you run. She was feeling a bit cold now, so now she'll warm up.
Hi, I missed the intro and about containers. I didn't really catch much about the size of can I convert an esky to make worm juice?
Great, good question. So you can, if it's at least 30 centimetres in height, so we do a bucket model where we just get, you can go to bakeries and they have those long buckets, as long as they're stackable, you can make a long, skinny worm farm if you're living in an apartment to fit in the corner where your laundry is. Make sure the bottom is sealed because you don't want worm juice everywhere, but the other two need to have holes in it so the worms can go up and down, up and down. That's a great model. You can use a bath And I remember seeing Costa, he has a little video about a bath model. Now, with a bath model, I don't know if he said this, so Costa, I'm way better than you, wherever you are. He's over there. You make sure the bath is slightly tilting because you want that worm juice. Okay, so you want that worm juice to run down. You don't want to scoop it up. So you have it slightly on a tilt and you put a bucket so the gravity is making the worm juice come down. I've used fruit, fruit boxes? Yeah, and even, what are they called, those plastic ones? Milk crates. Milk crates is actually good. You line it with hessian. Yeah, you can do 3. So you can do a really cheap model, or you can do the fancy one. Unfortunately, the fancy one these days costs about $100 unless you go on Marketplace. But yeah, you can buy, the bucket one's a favourite one in Brazil, because Brazil has, their cities are, they've got a lot of people and you've got small apartments, but if you can just have one corner where you can stack 3 buckets on, you can actually use all your compost. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I have tried to make worm farms myself, and then one day I put worm castings from a shop into my tumbler because I thought, they're all dried out, and I just got totally laden with worms.
You got the eggs.
So I wonder if it's a tumbleweed tumbler, whatever, just a big tumbler.
Yeah.
So I bought another one, and I just find it just works really well for me. But I can't really harvest the worm juice, but I do harvest the worms when they just all go into the garden when I harvest time.
Yeah, with that system, it's great, but because Californian reds are a bit lazy, most of them will be picked by magpies. I have 4 magpies that as soon as I come out the door, I thought it was cool, but I started to feel a bit freaked out because I'd walk out the door and the magpies are just waiting for me because they're like, she's bringing in worms. So if I do that, there's a good chance most of the worms will be eaten by birds, but I mean, you're feeding the native birds, or they're not strong enough to survive in a garden, especially if your garden is slightly compacted. Okay, they don't have the force. But yeah, it's a great way. Worms will actually, they'll tell you when they're not happy because they'll leave. Because people have said, oh my God, I just spent $20 on a bunch of worms and 3 days later they've all gone because they weren't happy with the bedding. Okay, if your bedding is slightly acidic, you'll have to change that. We can talk that after this one. Oh, there's 2, sorry, yep.
Hello, how are you? Thanks for the speech. At the beginning you were saying that they'll eat anything, which is a bit like myself.
Oh no, they eat more gross things.
Yeah, I'll eat anything myself too. No, my question was in regards to meat, because I've read something saying that you shouldn't put meat in, and partially some of the reason that they said that is because you can get fungi and mold and stuff. Is that a factor?
Look, I've done a few experiments with chicken bones. And if you want to do this experiment, it's pretty freaky. You put chicken bones in a worm farm, and within 4 days, because they're quite soft chicken bones, I'm like, where are my chicken bones? Okay, worms eat everything and anything. Why do they say don't put meat in? Because if you're living urban, there is a chance that some other bacteria might get in and start hanging out with your worms, and that creates smell, or it attracts other things, especially if people are using open compost. It's a bit like compost. You don't put dead animals in your compost in an urban area because your neighbour will be peeved off with you. They'll smell it if you haven't covered it properly, and it might attract rodents, okay, other things that want to eat. But saying that anything that is meat, anything that's bloody, so some women put organic tampons in the compost pile or the worm farm, and boom. It's one of the preferred. I think watermelon, I've noticed they love to eat watermelon, and they also love to eat bones. Now, a cow bone would take a lot more time to break down, but you'll find they'll just stick to it. You'll pick up a bone, and they've just all stuck to it and going, do you mind? we're sucking this, we're trying to get the last nutrients out of the... So I think it's more of an urban thing, because I know a lot of rural people with their worm farms, but then what you have to do, because we have worm farms in Brazil that are like this, really long. slightly on tilt so you can pick up we have to net it, because we'll have other things coming in. And that's another thing, a lot of the worm farms, they say, oh, look, you just throw all your scraps in there. But if you do that in Brazil, you have a giant ant's nest, because ants can go through. So we have to compost our food first and then give it to the worms. So if you live in an area like South Australia, we have some good chunky worms. If you have fire ants in your area, fire ants love worms, okay? They'll just sting it and then just walk away with it. You have to start composting things before you throw it into your worm farm. So if you have a worm farm, you open it up, you go, oh my God, it's full of ants. And if they're not the biting ones, they're just the little ones, you can just, find where their nest is, ruffle around, grab the eggs, throw them out, and start your worm farm again. You can sift it, you can dry it out, you can sift the worms, and we can talk about how you collect it in a second. But there is a question here.
So I have several worm farms. So I have the ones, where it's standing free.
Yep.
I feel sorry for them being locked away there. So I've got 3 where I've buried pots that are open at the bottom into the garden.
Yep.
And so I feed them, and I just assume that they're happier then because they can just come and go as they please. And so I don't collect the leachate from that, but I assume it's just doing something going into the garden.
For sure.
So so are they in their happy place like this? Or?
Yeah, because especially if you have an orchard, and do you know where the drip line of a tree is? So you have your tree, and there's at the end of the roots, they're drip, 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 yeah? So most trees, especially in temperate climates, follow that pattern, the mushroom pattern. So you've got the universal mushroom pattern. You've got the foliage, then you've got the trunk, and then you've got the roots, yeah? You've seen that sign? It's like one of the cosmic signs. So what you do is, to use the best way, these internal ones, is you go to the drip line, because most of the feeder roots are at the drip line. And you can actually pop mushrooms, but also your worm compost where the drip line is of your tree. And then, especially if you have trees that are maybe they're slightly diseased, or they're getting a bit older and they're not producing enough fruit, you can pop that on the side. When we moved into the house, there was an orange tree, a mandarin tree that had all that black moldy, waxy stuff all over the leaves. And the guy said, oh, you can cut that down. And I'm like, I'm not doing that. And I did exactly what you did. We put the worms at the drip line, and now it's fruiting. 10 years later, it's still fruiting, whereas they wanted to just chop it down. So worms do have that magic about them. Did that answer? Yeah, but whether they're happy or not, they've got 5 hearts. They're full of love. I don't think they're going to judge you. Do you know what I mean? If they're in a box and that, because their whole DNA, if we want to call it DNA, is to create soil. If they're creating it in a box or in a thing, I'm sure they're not saying, oh, my landlord's crap. They're overcharging me. As long as you feed them, because if they're not happy, they'll move. They find a way out. It's quite crazy. Now, if your worm farm, sometimes your worm farm gets a bit, people say, ooh, my worm farm is smelling like pee, it's smelling like ammonia. And that's because it's too wet. You're putting too much food in it. And worms get a horrible disease, and maybe this is when they're not happy. It's called protein disease, where they sort of are segmented. So instead of being one delicious worm, okay, they become parts of worms sort of held by a string. And that's when you overfeed worms. So you have to really make sure you don't overfeed worms. How do I do that? I make sure that when I use my apartment model, just half is food. They prefer fresh food or fresh meats over cooked food. But sometimes I put cooked food in there too. If you want to put cooked food into your worm farm, you have to make sure that you don't have so much salt in your diet anymore, because you have salty soil. Now, this doesn't matter. A bit of salty soil doesn't matter if you're looking at a really large property, but if you're living in a small urban area and you want your garden, you don't want to keep putting too much salt into your garden. So, worms, like I said, you can compost your food and your fresh veggie scraps and that, you can give it to your worms. And then when your worms are hungry, like when I'm traveling, if I'm traveling for 3 weeks or something, I just go and buy a sack of horse poo, and I just fill up my worm farm. Because, horse poo sort of leaves lots of air, so they can still walk through, they can still, move through. But with your compost, if you're a compost maker or you're a worm, I usually say partnership. I have a partnership with worms. But if I do want to become a worm farmer, what was I going to say then? I've forgotten. Oh, that's it. Make sure what you put in is diverse. Because if you're just going to use, I know some people that use the Berkeley composting method, which is just horse poo and hay, horse poo and hay. What comes out is nutritious, but it's not as nutritious if you add other forms that are dying or have veggie peels and that. So the more you put in, the more you get out. Okay, now the gross things that worms love are nails. They got no problem with fingernails. So if one thing, cutting fingernails, I get really gross when people cutting their toenails on there. Put in the worm farm. Let the worms eat it. And they love it. Hair, believe it or not, worms love hair. So if you're in a mood and you're chopping your fringe or whatever, what I always do, I collect all the hair, or you're shaving your beard off. Worms love it. Okay? As I said, they love blood. So if you want to experiment with some of your organic menstrual products, you can give it to worms. They love it. So a lot of women empty their little, their moon cups and things like that into the worms, and the worms will be like, yeah. They absolutely love it. They love poop, okay? Even human poop. Thing is with human poop, that if you're going to say, or dog poo or cat poo, okay, we have a lot of pathogens as well. So if you're going to compost human manure or dog or cat feces, you need to use 2 things: time or temperature. Okay, so if there's a pathogen, you poop out a pathogen, it's looking for a host. So it's in your poo and it's just waiting. And if you're going to put it in a garden and some child or some other adult is playing around the garden, they find another host. But if you're going to compost it, it will die in time because there's no host. So you need at least 6 months. Or you need temperature. Our body temperature is 36, 37, yeah? So if you compost, if you make a really good compost pile and you leave it out there and it hits 50 degrees, and a good compost pile, if you mix the right carbon and nitrogen, will hit around 50 degrees, and that will burn all the pathogens. And then you just leave a bit of extra time there. So all this, that's why a lot of festivals love also composting toilets, because you actually make soil. Especially if it's a festival once a year or something, because the human manure sits there for a year. And now that you can use also efficient microbes, spraying efficient microbes to fasten the track. So yeah, you can add worms to that, but you can't do it when it's hot, because remember, worms full of water. So if you put a worm next to a hot compost pile, it'll just burn. So if you've got a compost pile at home and you want to add worms, you can dig a trench around the compost pile, you can add worms, cover it with hay, because they want to be nice and cool, okay? They don't want sun, and the worms will slowly move into your compost pile at their temperature. They go, oh, this is good, because, they don't have noses, but they sense everything. They know that there's a big food pile there that's hot, and they'll go into the edges. And then when it cools down, they'll go in further and further. Before you know it, it's been consumed, and you've got really nice, crumbly black soil. Any questions? I've got to check the time. Ooh, I'm doing good. Okay, so how do you remove your worms? Oh, sorry, there's a question over here. Stephanie, that's a big run right in the corner. Pardon?
I did a compost here in Woodford and got mostly black soldier flies instead of worms, but added 1 or 2 worms. Do they work together? Are they complementary? And the black soldier fly larvae seem to love it this summer.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if the worms take over in the winter.
Yes, Well, they take over after it cools down. That's another question. People often say, okay, I open up my worm farm and flies come out. And that's because usually, if you're like me, you're cooking at home or there's food lying around and you're throwing in your compost, your kitchen scraps into your compost, and you've forgotten to put the lid on, and you go off and, you watch your favourite series and you come back, you go, oh shit, the lid's, or the lid isn't on my compost pile. And then you go through, give it to the worms. And a couple of days later, it's full of larvae. And that you're responsible of taking it. The fly has laid eggs in your compost pile, and you take it to the worms, or not your compost scraps. Sorry. So you're taking compost scraps into a compost pile or a worm farm, and then they just and then you have lots of flies. Now, one thing in the worm farm, in your apartment model, you've got a lid on there. So they're not able, with the worm farms, the flies aren't able to spread their wings. So they'll just die in your worm farm. And what will the worms do? Yum, protein. They'll go eat the larvae. But it looks gross. And what happens when you have too much larvae? It gets really mushy. And it smells like, once again, it smells like ammonia. It could smell quite poopy as well. So instead of touching it, if you're grossed out, you get cardboard, no colour, you make your strips, and you just poke that in the mushy bit. Okay, and what will happen is your cardboard will absorb all the extra liquid, and in a day or two it's quite dry. Okay, and then the worms will eat the cardboard because they love cellulose. Okay, they go crazy over it. You can see if you put a piece of cardboard there and they'll just attach to it, you'll strip the cardboard open, and where the cardboard is corrugated inside, in between, there's a worm in each one of the little things. So you're like, yep, they love cardboard. So in your area, once you start experimenting with worms, you can make a little, a cook list. So much, I want to create just a barrel in my kitchen for worms, but I don't cook. My husband's the one who cooks, and he's like, there's too many barrels, because I want one for compost, one for birds, one for this, one for that. So unfortunately, we shove it all together, and I put my hand in and separate, but I don't mind about being goopy. Any questions? So I'll just tell you, I've got 5 minutes. How do I separate the worms? So what happens, you open your worm farms, and you're like, whoa, I have a lot of worms. And you look at the trays, and all the trays are filled with worms. Then you know it's time to separate some worms. Otherwise, what will happen, worms will start dying. And sure, the other worms will eat the worms, but do you know what I mean? Why do that? You might as well share it. So one of my favorite ways is I get an onion bag. You know the onion bags that you buy some onions there? You fill it with cow poo or horse poo, and then you just put it on the top. 24 hours later, you'll pick it up, and it will be full of worms. And you'll be like, that was easy. Because people have sifters, they dry it out, and they do this and that. And what you do every day, you just do that. You fill up an onion bag, you put it in your worm farm, and then the next day, you pop the lid back on. The next day, it's full, and you can give it away, or you can sell it. Worms sell at the moment for about $40 a kilogram. Okay, and you can make a kilo of worms. Literally, once you have a healthy worm farm, you can make a kilo of worms in 2 months. Okay, because they'll just be making babies. How do you know if your worms are making babies? So I've got a few things here. Sorry, I've got a bit of a sore back, so I had a bit of a planting accident. So I'm like, argh. So your worms will have that band. When they have that little band on them, okay, they're ready to have babies. And what will happen when you open your worm farm up, you'll see that they're hermaphrodites. You'll see that one worm is stuck to the other worm because they have male and female organs. Okay? So the male organ has to attach to the female organ. They don't do it themselves. They have to attach to another worm that has a female organ. And then this one goes, oh, where's your male organ? So when you find a ball of worms, you're going to have a lot of babies. okay? Because they are reproducing, which is quite nice. So, sometimes I pick them up, I'm like, sorry guys, interrupting, but, I have to move you on. Because sometimes it's also an easy way to separate. When you see a ball of worms, you just pick it up and gently put it in another place and go, okay, have babies here. So another way too is to dry is the Buddhist method, which is to empty your worm farm and you leave it in the sun and the worms will crawl further inside of your mound. So you take it up, make a nice little mound, it's in the sun, they start getting hot, so they go further in. And then you scrape the first layer, and this is a really nice way to do it with children. You scrape the first layer and pop it in a bucket, and then you wait, and then the worms go further in, and you scrape it until you're left with a small triangle full of worms, because they don't like the heat, and obviously they don't like the light. And then the old-fashioned sifter, where you dry it out a bit, throw it on a sifter, and you shake it. But I prefer to do it the onion bag way. It's really easy. You don't have to do any work. You let them do the work. They want to eat that. So you don't feed them for a few days. You put the onion bag, and they want to eat that. So they just all crawl into the onion bag. So obviously you're not looking for an onion bag with tightly woven. You want the weave that's quite big so they can crawl in. Okay, I think I've used my time up, darlings. Let's have a look. Yes. Any more questions? Yep, there's a question here. Sorry, Steph, we have to keeping it running. And later, if you want to come and have a look at the worms. Yes.
So when you're building your worm farm, what volume of worms do you need for a container? Obviously, depending on the size
I think
of the container.
people always say get a kilo, but I literally just, I've started worm farms just with eggs. As the chap, where is he? There he is. That he used the tumbleweed. You can actually buy worm compost from somewhere, and just wait, because you have lots of these little orangey eggs in them. Often you can't see them because you have to move it around. But yeah, I usually just say a handful. Okay. Yeah, handful. Cut it down. Like I said, living in Brazil for 20 years and realizing that some of the literature was sort of just repeated. It was just like regurgitated. Then I was just like, oh, you know what? And like still, some of the permaculture literature says, use newspaper for your garden. No. Because when Bill Mollison wrote, and a few of us oldies will remember that, when Bill Mollison wrote the book, our journals, our newspapers didn't have colour. It was black and white, and you were lucky if you got 1 or 2 pieces of colour paper, and it was soya ink. Now the ink is different, and it's full of colour. So you don't want to put this coloured ink into your food garden, okay? So when people say, throw newspaper down to start your no-dig garden, no, don't. Look for cardboard that, if you want to use paper, use cardboard that does not have colour. That's really important, because you don't want to put that extra stuff in you. Things have changed 30 years ago, and we keep regurgitating information. Any more questions? Yes. Do you want to scream it out so Stephanie will...
So you just start off with your bed.
Yes.
And then when they're full, they climb up to the next one? Or
So what I do, with the apartment model, I usually take one, I'm at a school, we're going to make a new model, which I'll be doing Wednesday with the school kids. So I tell them, hide that other tray, or just leave it on top, and you're using 2 trays. So you make the bedding. And then once it starts filling up... You've got more questions, just do it over the side. Okay, yeah. You pop the other bed on, and then you just start adding food. I just put food in the corner. I usually put a bit of hay or dry leaves because they like that carbon. And I just pop that, and they'll just climb up. And then they'll all move up. And then you'll be like, yes, it's free. You can use that. But even with that, I find a lot of worms hide in that spot. So you can actually just use the onion bags to get those last worms if you don't want to throw them in your garden. Especially when you're starting off, you need every worm counts. But as you've got lots of worms, you can actually start moving on. Now, I can stand over here. I'm just going to do a bit of a plug now. We have got this amazing resource here. It's a card pack. It's called Seed to Plate. There's 70 different permaculture plants, edible flowers, and herbs. And for this special occasion, we're selling it over the side, but we're giving away 3 amazing, I call them zines because I'm from South Australia, but I think you call them zines here. Yeah, zines. But zines about medicinal gardening and other things. So you can just have a look if you're interested. Or you can go to our shop at Planet Schooling and you find lots of learning materials that we use. Brennan's down there. Oh, rock stars in presence. So yeah, thank you very much. And I'm over here if you want to have a chat, huh? Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy.